Withy Beds. Um, in essence, what we have in Withy Beds is what I think is a forgotten resource in this area, at least, and certainly a lost habitat. Um, there are several ways of looking at Withy Beds. What you've got is social history, you've got industrial history, and you've got natural history, all in one place, really, I suppose. Oh, come on. There we go. Whoops. What is a withy bed? Well, essentially, it is a small managed plantation of trees, absolutely grown as a crop, as a resource for use by people. What you see in this picture is a withy stool with the rods growing out of it. And you see the fairly clean undergrowth underneath the withies, which provided a habitat for so many things, which I'll talk about a bit more later. Here's a withy bed. This is actually at Slimbridge, but it's in the process of being harvested. And you can see the withy stools in the background. And the process of harvesting was a sort of miniature version of pollarding natural big mature willow trees. The harvesting was carried out in different ways depending on what you wanted to use the withy rods for, which again I'll talk about a little more in a minute. This withy bed is quite wet, but it's not soaking wet because it's essentially planted on relatively dry ground. The older withy beds, which you'll see in a minute, were planted in the bottom of the old clay pits that were attached to the brickworks around Gloucester, and that really is the essence of industrial history. So the origin of withies, also referred to as osiers, natural trees in the ancient wetlands, in the fens, in Sedgemoor, in any wetland area. It was a source of natural material for hunter-gatherers to utilize for all sorts of things. When people started to settle and become farmers and move away from the hunter-gatherer way of living, withy beds started to be cultivated because you could actually cultivate them close to where you were living. And I see it as one of the oldest forms of forestry, of tree husbandry. And as I've said, in Gloucestershire, there is a connection to brickmaking, which was critically important because the brickworks provided the materials for Cheltenham, Gloucester, Tewkesbury to grow and expand with the population. And the brickworks also created spaces for withy beds to be planted and grown. Sorry, I'm just checking to see if anybody else is in the waiting room. Not at the moment. Okay, good. So withies, osiers were a ubiquitous resource. Wherever willows grew, you could harvest them. And this is true really across the whole of Northern Europe, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Germany, Scandinavia, and Britain. The withies were available for a wide variety of uses, depending on their age and their size. They were quick and easy to obtain and relatively easy to work with. Completely natural material, of course. And you can see from this slide how widespread withy growing was in Britain. All of these place names are taken from the connection with withies from willow trees. The other word for a withy bed, which Mike Smart will tell you about, is a perch. And the word perch is where you get the origin of Pershore in Worcestershire and Pershore in Staffordshire from. This slide is essentially a paragraph from the Oxford English Dictionary, which Mike kindly sent to me quite a few years ago. My interest in this came out of the research from my Marsh Warbler book. And it just added a whole different dimension to the story. Essentially, withies or osiers are the flexible branches or twigs of willow. Particular species, Salix viminalis, also Salix triandra, and various hybrids. But there's another way of looking at perch or perch. The withy beds around Gloucestershire particularly were owned or operated by families, and they were named perches, as in Cresswell's perch, Shiner's perch, and Jean's perch, for example. But perch could indicate a form of ownership. If you look at the Welsh English dictionary, perchin or perchinogion represents an owner. Perchinogaeth is ownership, and perchinogi is to possess or to own. So I think there's more to the perch and perch thing than it just being an old English word. It could be something much more ancient, perhaps. So with these osiers and the harvesting, growing and using of them was critically important in the days before we had plastic and cardboard, because you could use the willow ones, the withies, to make almost anything you can imagine. These are fences and hurdles, which in some places, like the Forest of Dean, might have been made of chestnut or hazel, but down in the Vale would be much more likely to be made of willow. You could make a boat, a coracle. This is a coracle made of woven willow and then covered with hide. Fish traps, something else that was quite important in the Severn Vale. Fishing in the freshwater waters was big business. People were catching eels and various freshwater fish to eat, as well, of course, as salmon in the Severn. Here's an old boy making or using fish traps. I suspect this was over in the east of the country, the Fenland or somewhere like that. And these are the putchers that would have been used for salmon. But in the picture, the guy there has got putchers on the left, and he's also making one of those bottle traps on the right. This, of course, was in the days before salmon putchers started to be made of steel. There are a few of those down on the riverbank at Orr, and they're awful things, not natural at all. This, excuse me a second. Someone in. These images are from the Severn estuary, and it shows how important salmon was in the River Severn, above the Severn Bridge area now, right up to Gloucester, where ranks of putchers would be put into those frames that extended way out into the river. The salmon would come upriver on the tide turned, the fish would start to go back downstream, get caught in the putchers, the open end of which always faced upstream, and they couldn't back out. So when the tide dropped, you just went out, pulled your salmon out. If they were still alive and kicking, you whack them over the head with a priest. When I was a kid, sort of 4 or 5 years old, my dad worked on the railway station at Newham, and people like Buster Hardy, who used to catch salmon with putchers, but also with a lave net, would wrap them in newspaper, which he would dampen, and he'd wrap them in sacking, tied up with baler twine, bring it down to the railway station. And my dad would take the money off him, put the salmon on the train, 9, 10 o'clock in the morning, 8 o'clock that night. People were eating Severn salmon in hotels in London. In modern times, we're being a little more inventive with our use of withies. What you've got here is two versions of the prevention of erosion. The upper picture is an embankment reinforcing screen. Excuse me. And in the lower picture, you've got a walkway. And that walkway seems to be sort of quite innovative. But in the Somerset levels, people were making walkways like that in prehistoric times. There are still plenty of instances of those walkways being found now as drainage goes on or as agricultural work or archaeology goes on. Not a new thing at all. Here's some work going on. As you can see, they've put one of those walkways for a small earth moving machine. And then in the lower picture, stakes driven into the bank and then padded out with what we call bush faggots, which is bundles of withies, gives the opportunity for silt to build up and reinforce the riverbank, prevent the erosion. So a lot of that goes on in places like the Low Countries in Holland and Belgium. And at Slimbridge, if you've been there recently, they've got a nice new visitor area being constructed, and they're using willow woven into these steel and chicken wire frameworks to create works of art. That picture was taken just a couple of weeks ago. Those things are almost complete now, by the way. So when you go down there, look out for them. There's one with a swan. There's one with a dragonfly. I can't remember what the other one is, but it all looks very pretty. Something else you can do with willow is charcoal. This is willow charcoal. It's made by Coates of Somerset, who I'll talk about later. Charcoal, of course, is a standard material for almost any artist worth his salt. And you can have it in different grades. You can have it in different sizes. And where's the willow in that picture, you ask yourself? Well, the tunics are Stroud scarlet. The hats are bearskins, and the bearskins are supported by a framework of willow. So in each of those hats, there is a willow framework with the bearskin attached to it. And of course, baskets and basket work. As I said, before the days of plastic and cardboard, you needed containers of all sorts of shapes and sizes. And willow was one of the perfect materials to use to make them. Just different varieties. Lovely picnic set on the left, and the trunks on the back of the car. And then down in the bottom right-hand corner, sort of industrial baskets for laundry, for mail, for anything you can imagine. And furniture. You could make all sorts of furniture out of willow. It just depended on the level of skill and how much time you wanted to invest in making it. And this stuff was a cottage industry all over the country. And coming back into fashion, natural burials, willow coffins, big business now. Much more readily available in some cases than the timber. When I left school, I started work as a trainee surveyor. Within a fortnight, I was a trainee undertaker. We used to make all of our coffins out of oak or elm. Nothing else. The old man wouldn't have it. It had to be oak or elm. But in modern times, people are more inclined to be, shall we say, green. So willow is a perfectly good material to use. Just to sort of emphasize the industrial nature of this business, in the early 20th century, to the north of the cathedral in Gloucester city centre in Pitt Street, there was a basket works. It's identified there on the 1910 Ordnance Survey map. I think that's probably now part of the King's School, if my geography is right. But that was a factory where all of those basket work containers were made. And the owners of that factory were the Finch family. What you have at the top there is the sort of information in the newspaper that Finch and Son Limited were setting up a new company, a new limited company and business. Shares were on offer, and it mentions their factory in Pitt Street. And then down below is an advertisement from the 7th of June 1919, advertising their goods. And one of the boasts that they make in the small print at the bottom, as you can see, is that they trained and employed disabled soldiers and sailors from the Great War, which had just about finished by June 1919. Something they were very proud of. It was a good thing to do. And here you see an early 19th century job advertisement at the top. James Brewer in Cirencester, looking for a journeyman basket maker. A journeyman was a skilled tradesman, but not super skilled, so that he was a supervisor. He would have been an ordinary working man, able to make baskets. And at the bottom, an extract from the Gloucester Journal of 18th of January 1910. Gloucester fruit and veg market, in the Eastgate, was much more important in those days than it is now. And the announcement is that the chairman of the Markets Committee is looking for the supply of 2,000 baskets. That is an awful lot of baskets, but it sort of illustrates how much fruit and veg was going through Eastgate Market in those days. And again, there wasn't much alternative. There was no plastic, there was no cardboard. Basket making was very much a family business as well. From the top left, you see an extract from Kelly's Trades Directory in 1920, and there are 5 basket makers there. Finch and Son, we've already mentioned, who were a proper commercial outfit. But Hector, in the middle there, you can see his advertisement on the right from Smart's Gloucester Directory in 1919. He was a one-man outfit at 13 Barton Street, and you can see that he was making chairs, tables, and baskets, and he would offer to make anything from any design of your own. At the bottom, from January 1887, this again comes from the Gloucester Journal, Samuel Amos was retiring due to ill health and handing over his business to his nephew, Harry Lear Fudge. But he was going to continue working from the same place, from St John's Cottage in the cattle market in Gloucester. Now, in those days, the cattle market was in a very different place from where most of us remember it. It was adjacent to the Great Western Railway station. And just as a matter of interest, I got onto Ancestry and I searched the 1911 census just for the occupation of basket maker, and I came up with all of these names in the Gloucester area, Gloucestershire, and I've highlighted some of them. The man at the top, Alfred Duvet, was born in France, but he was working at Park Street in Gloucester. Harry Lear Fudge on the left, we've just spoken about. And several of these guys sadly ended up in the workhouse or in the lunatic asylum, as you can see from the column there. there was one guy, James Willis, working at Avon Street in Bristol, who was born in the USA. So he'd obviously come here to be a basket maker. Down at the bottom, William Wood, still a basket maker at the age of 82 in Newent. It just sort of shows how widespread this trade was. The Jacksons, James and William Jackson at Broad Oak and Westbury-on-Severn, I think they were father and son. And I remember a Jackson from when I was a kid who was still making salmon putchers at Broad Oak. It was probably, I guess, a grandson of one of those two. So this is a tetrad map, and it's based on the tetrad map of the marsh warbler breeding records from my book. But what it does is it illustrates where the majority of the withy beds were. And you can see that they're basically along the fresh waterways. There are very few withy beds below the Horseshoe Bend on the Severn because the water gets brackish below that point. And you will see from this quote, Mellersh, in his treatise on the birds of Gloucestershire, published in 1902, he records the limit of the osier beds to the south. And he says clearly that osier beds end as one goes down the river at the bend before the straight reach of water opposite Bollow. Bollow is on the west side, more or less opposite Epney. Below there, the banks are lower and they're subject to being too much covered with salt water. The osiers, the withy beds, the willows didn't like the salt water, the brackish water. So moving on to the brick industry, withy beds were strongly associated with brick making around Gloucester. There was a Roman legionary tile and brickworks on the site of St Oswald's Priory, immediately north of the west gate of the old walled city. The brickworks apparently continued production following the departure of the Romans, so into the Dark Ages, and it was run as a commercial concern to supply the Colonia, the attached town. And if you find one of these long, wide, very shallow bricks, they're not very thick, stamped RPG, that will tell you for sure that they were Roman manufactured. RPG meaning Re Publica Gliventium, which means from the public works at Gloucester. In Victorian Gloucestershire, bricks were required by the millions to build Gloucester, Cheltenham, Tewkesbury, and the other towns around about, complete with their works and factories. I did at one time calculate roughly how many bricks there were in a Victorian street. And I can't remember what it was now, but it was millions. Here's a view of the River Severn. It's one of Francis Frith's photographs. You can see the River Severn. You can see the railway viaduct. You can see the cathedral and St John's Church behind that. Down the left-hand side is the towpath, because, of course, the Severn was a highway for... Sorry, that's my birdie clock telling me it's 8 o'clock. The towpath was all about horses dragging barges up and down the river, carrying goods to and from settlements upstream, and particularly to and from the Midlands. But if you turn around and look in the other direction, you get this. T.A. Coward, who wrote the 3-volume Birds of Britain and Their Nests, visited Gloucester to see marsh warblers. And in his journal, he wrote about a brickworks on one side of me and the town tip on the other, both smoking. And that was the area around Westgate. It was a heavily industrialized area. It's quite sort of green and pleasant now when it's not flooded. But in those days, it was an industrial site. And this was the same all over the country, particularly in the Victorian age when bricks were were needed by the countless millions. So this is the area we're looking at, from Maesmore down to Olney Island, with Walham at the centre of it. And what we have in here is a large number of these withy beds and brickworks. And this is a map that I put together. I had a list of 26 withy beds and brickworks in this sort of area at one time. And you can see a number of these withy beds are named Walham Perch, Robinson's Perch, Tandy's Pit, Cress's Perch. And each of those withy beds was operated by a different family or a different person. But that was all driven by the brickworks in the first place, the excavation of the clay beds. And as the clay beds fell out of use for clay, they silted up and they were planted up with withies, which became a secondary industry, sat alongside the brickworks. And those industries did run alongside one another. Interestingly, they weren't just used locally. This is an extract from the website of the government of Gibraltar Ministry for Heritage. And what you see in the picture on the right is a brick marked Tandy in a wall in Gibraltar. That brick came from Walham at Gloucester, from Tandy's Pit. The Tandy family were entrepreneurial people. There were a number of them. They owned the brickworks, but they also had a pub called the Mitre, which was in a street that's no longer there. It's underneath what used to be Debenham's department store, between the Oxbow and I can't remember the name of the street the other side there. Doesn't really matter. But yeah, they had various other businesses in the town. But it's interesting that they were exporting bricks to Gibraltar from Gloucester. What you see here is an enlargement. Tandy's Pit or Perch at the top, the smaller semicircular Cress's Perch to the left, and then on the south side of that arm of the river, Walham Brickworks. Down in the bottom left-hand corner is Walham House. That later became a pub called the Jolly Waterman. But you can see the withy beds identified by the little plants dotted all around those wet areas and the industrial complex of the Walham Brickworks. Tandy's Pit looks like that today. It was being used as a coarse fishing pond. You get to it by going to Maesmore Bridge and then taking the farm track down to the right, opposite the coal yard. And if you go down to the bottom of the lane, Tandy's Pit is on the left-hand side, and that's what it looks like now. Still some willows there, as you can see, but it's basically silting up. So what did a withy bed look like? So that's a fairly close-up view of a withy bed. I sort of described it before. Charlie Whitfield, who I'll talk about in a minute, he talked about the withy stocks being planted a yard and a half between, and they were started as cuttings from mature trees. That's Charlie. Charlie was called up for the First World War, and he was rejected on the basis that he had cardiac arrhythmia. So he went back home. His day job was at Foster's Oil Mills in the docks. He also fished for eels and salmon. He ran the pub, the Jolly Waterman. He grows 60% of his own vegetables and food. And he harvested withies during the winter. And he lived to the age of 92, but he wasn't fit enough to go to the front line and get shot. And he talked about the Withy Beds, he said the stool grew long straight shoots to about 6 feet in each spring-summer season. The first rods, which were used for basket work, were cut at 2 years old and bundled. Each bundle had to be 1 yard, that's 1 inch, in circumference, tightly bound with 2 withy bonds, and you had to mark the bond. And he said your thumbnail did go black and drop off by the end of the season from marking the bond. Now, Charlie at one time would have harvested those withies and basically taken them straight to Pitt's Basket Works, but latterly they were put on the train to the market at Evesham. Charlie reckoned to begin cutting in November. He would have the first cuts, the first harvest done before Armistice Day. He worked in the flooded pits with his legs wrapped in brown paper from dawn to dark, and he would drag the bundles out at the end of the day by lantern light. And as I said, this was a man who wasn't fit enough to go into the trenches and be shot. The green rods were harvested first and were used for making hurdles. They weren't treated in any particular way. Brown rods became coloured when either air dried or steamed, and they were used for rustic garden chairs and coarse baskets. White rods were at the top end of the market. They were stored in pits from harvest time right through until May, and those pits were wet so that it would keep the withies alive, basically. And then they would be stripped in May to remove the bark. And the cut bundles then, as I said, were shipped away to the markets latterly around Evesham. Different thicknesses, different lengths, and therefore different ages were used for different purposes. They weren't all the same size and shape. What you see here is a picture of bundles being stored in a shed on the left, and the white rods being stored, having had their bark stripped, out in a field there drying in the sun. So Withy Beds as a habitat, we get away from the industry and the business. A number of people helped me out with this because they knew the Withy Beds when they were operating, and I didn't. It was a microcosmic environment managed to a high degree for the withy production, and as such it became an artificially enhanced super habitat. It was also largely undisturbed because the people who owned the pits, who harvested the withies, didn't want anybody climbing about in there. And the density of the vegetation was critical. Garden wildlife surveys carried out primarily in search of invertebrates have shown that the variety of species and the number of specimens is directly related to the volume of the herbaceous growth. It was found to be even more important than the variety of plants or whether or not the plants were native. And this seems to indicate why the Withy Beds were so productive in terms of nature. Mike Spart referred to Withy Beds as resembling a rainforest in miniature and buzzing with insects. John Christian used to go into the Withy Beds at times with Charlie. He knew Charlie very well. And he talked about emerging from an insect-infested Withy Bed, sweating and stinking and bitten to death by mosquitoes. Plant life. I'm no botanist, but a lot of this information actually came again from my marsh warbler research, because the egg collectors who were after the marsh warblers recorded many of the plants that the nests were found in on their data cards. And John Christian also mentioned a number of things there. Umbellifers, nettles, tansy, ragwort, meadowsweet, willow herb, all of that stuff. It's really interesting. A lot of that stuff is still there on the riverbanks and in the wet areas around Walham and up the river towards Tewkesbury. Bird life was very important. 9 out of the 11 species of British warblers That was the reed, the sedge, the marsh, the blackcap, the garden warbler, the whitethroat, the lesser whitethroat, willow warbler, and chiffchaff were all breeding in those withy beds. Great blue, coal, and long-tailed tits, blackbird and song thrush, robin, wren, and dunnock, water rails, moor hens, a lot of ducks in the winter, heron and bitterns, great spotted woodpeckers, to a degree lesser spotted woodpeckers as well up near Tewkesbury, nuthatch and tree creeper, magpies, and even tawny owls. Tawny owls sometimes nested in old magpie nests in the withy beds. We won't dwell on that too much. That's my marsh warbler, but there is a marsh warbler, and that is a nest in a withy bed. The withy beds and the marsh warblers in Gloucestershire were absolutely tied together. You couldn't separate them. The marsh warblers were very much dependent on withy beds as a habitat. Reptiles, grass snakes, adders, slowworms, frogs, toads, newts, and probably a few lizards as well. All of those mammals down the right-hand side found in withy beds at various times. And invertebrates, I mean, I've just sort of grouped them together, but you probably couldn't count all of the invertebrates that were in those withy beds. Moths, two moths in particular, the herald and the lackey, were both very key inhabitants of the withy beds. Dragons and damsels, of course. So where are the withy beds today? Well, most of them are derelict. This is an old withy bed along the River Kennet down in Berkshire, but that's very similar to what remains of withy beds in Gloucestershire, just totally derelict, overgrown, silted up, and of no particular interest to anyone or anything, sadly. Somerset, P.H. Coat and Sons have been operating since 1819. They're still going strong. This is their website. And they are still making baskets, environmental goods, coffins, all sorts of anything you can imagine, and charcoal. And they have a visitor centre. So if you go down to the Somerset levels, it is worth having a look. It's over here, excuse me, to the west of the M5 near Taunton, as you go towards Langport. As I said, they have a museum, they have a visitor centre with a museum in it. They have a restaurant. They, of course, have a shop, as you always exit through the gift shop. These are the sort of things that they used to make. And still do to a degree. You know, if you had one of these sort of goat carts, which was derelict, if you take it to Coates, they will restore it for you. There's the gift shop. Here are a few pictures from their sort of historical archive. This is the modern business. This is planting withies. This weird and wonderful contraption is something of their own design. It's based on a sort of caterpillar tractor with this weird trailer on the back. You've got four guys lined up there, and they've each got a rectangular bucket with what looks like pencils in it. And those yellow wheels have got holes in them. And what they're doing is sticking the willow pencils into the holes. And as those wheels rotate, they're automatically plugged straight into the ground. It's a very clever machine. And you can see the yellow thing that sticks out of the side of the cab. It's on the left of the cab in the upper picture, and it's just in the right-hand side of the cab on the lower picture. That is the gauge that the driver uses to make sure he's going in a straight line along the withy bed. And then when it comes to harvesting, of course, no more is Charlie Whitfield there with his brown paper covered legs. It's all done by again, a harvesting machine that seems to be of Coates's own invention. And they do give a nod to wildlife. There are woodland trails. They do guided walks. So if ever you feel the need, Coates is quite a good place to go and have a look.